Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after someone breaks your heart is not to beg, explain, or prove anything. It's to move on like he never mattered in the first place. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because when a woman stops centering her life around someone who underestimated her, it sends a shock to his ego that hits harder than any confrontation ever could. Your peace, your progress, and your sudden emotional freedom become the unexpected wake-up call he never thought he'd have to face. There is a very specific kind of silence that hits a man's ego the hardest. The silence that comes after he expected you to break. When you detach completely, when you move forward with a sense of calm certainty, it creates a shockwave he could never prepare for. Because, whether he admitted it or not, he was counting on your emotional attachment. He believed you would hold on longer than you should, that you'd linger in the aftermath, that you'd still be watching, waiting, or wishing for him to return. Your detachment interrupts that narrative instantly. It forces him to confront the truth that his presence in your life wasn't as essential as he imagined. And that realization that you can walk away without hesitation disrupts the ego in a way no argument or confession ever could. When you move on like he never mattered, you take away the emotional leverage he assumed he had. Ego thrives on being needed, being wanted, being missed. It feeds on the idea that you will still feel something even after he's gone: sadness, anger, heartbreak, confusion. But when you stop giving those emotions space, when you stop mentally replaying conversations or wondering about his next move, his ego loses the fuel it depends on. The detachment feels like rejection, not because you intended to hurt him, but because your absence reveals the truth he tried to avoid. Your life continues, beautifully and uninterrupted, without him. The shock for him comes from contrast. While he expected you to dwell, you decide to rise. While he expected tears, he sees clarity. While he thought you'd reach out, you instead reach forward, into your own growth, your own joy, your own freedom. This unpredictability unsettles him. It forces him to question the assumptions he made about your emotional dependence. And that discomfort grows each time he realizes he no longer occupies your thoughts. He notices your silence, your composure, your glow returning. He notices that you don't react, don't chase, don't check in. What he notices most is that his presence or absence no longer affects you, and that is the moment his ego begins to fracture. Your detachment also strips away the illusion of control. When a man believes a woman will always stay attached, he moves with a certain level of arrogance. He becomes careless with your feelings because he assumes you'll still be there afterward. But when you detach, you take back the emotional authority he assumed he had. You show without words that you were always the one capable of walking away. You just hadn't chosen to yet. And once you do choose it, he understands something he never wanted to face. He wasn't the one holding the power. Your indifference becomes something he cannot ignore, not because you're trying to make a statement, but because your life is speaking for you. The way you carry yourself, the way you move forward, the way you refuse to let his choices dictate your happiness, all of it sends a message that pierces his ego more deeply than anger ever could. Anger keeps you connected, silence disconnects you completely, and that disconnection is what makes him realize the true impact of losing your presence. What he never expected was that you would rise so gracefully, that you would rebuild without hesitating, that you would choose yourself so fully. Your detachment shows him that he was not the anchor he thought he was. You were simply a woman capable of loving deeply, and even more capable of letting go when necessary. And nothing dismantles a man's ego more thoroughly than realizing the woman he took for granted has moved on like he was nothing more than a temporary stop on the way to a life she was destined for all along. There comes a moment after a breakup where you realize that your healing is no longer about him, or the relationship, or the story you thought you were writing together. It becomes about reclaiming the parts of yourself you dimmed, neglected, or compromised while trying to make something work that wasn't meeting your needs. Reinventing your identity after him isn't about creating a new version of yourself out of spite. It's about rediscovering the version of you that existed before his influence, and then evolving into someone even stronger, wiser, and more grounded. That process of reinvention, quiet, intentional, and deeply personal, is what shakes his ego to its core. When you start rebuilding your life, you aren't trying to send a message, yet that's exactly what happens. Because the moment you redirect your focus from the pain he caused to the person you're becoming, you shift the energy completely. You stop responding to memories and start responding to opportunities. You stop labeling yourself by what happened and start defining yourself by what you're creating next. And as you begin to reconnect with your passions, your confidence, and your emotional independence, the weight he once held in your life naturally dissolves. That emotional freedom is something no explanation, no closure, no confrontation could ever deliver. It's born entirely from your decision to rise. Reinventing yourself doesn't require dramatic changes. It begins in small choices, the habits you reintroduce, the people you reconnect with, the environments you seek out, the goals you revive. It's the moment you start waking up with a sense of purpose again, or the moment you catch yourself smiling for no reason, except that your heart finally feels lighter. It's when your self-worth no longer fluctuates based on someone else's attention. Each of these shifts rebuilds your identity piece by piece, and each piece strengthens your emotional independence. And as that independence grows, his relevance in your life naturally shrinks. The ego blow comes from realization. He notices that the version of you who once questioned herself now stands firmly in her value. The woman who once accepted breadcrumbs now expects and gives herself the full meal. The person who once depended on his validation now validates herself effortlessly. It's not that you're trying to prove anything, it's that your evolution proves everything. And what it proves most clearly is that you never needed him to become whole. You simply needed to stop giving your energy to someone who couldn't appreciate it. Reinventing your identity means rewriting the narrative of your life without him as a central character. At first, that feels like an emotional challenge, but slowly it becomes the most liberating transformation you could imagine. You begin to see that the relationship taught you something valuable, not about love, but about boundaries, self-respect, emotional clarity, and the importance of choosing people who choose you wholeheartedly. That awareness shapes your next chapter with stronger standards and a deeper understanding of what you deserve. The moment he sees you thriving in your own lane, he understands that he wasn't the catalyst for your happiness, you were. Your glow isn't a revenge tactic, it's a byproduct of healing correctly. Your confidence isn't for him to witness, it's for you to embody. Yet witnessing it affects him deeply because it contradicts every assumption he had about how much you needed him. Ego expects you to crumble. Reinvention shows that you were always capable of rising higher, and in that rise, the power dynamic that once existed disappears completely. You are no longer the woman he remembers. You are the woman you were meant to become. The one who outgrew him, outpaced him, and outshined the version of yourself that ever tolerated his inconsistency. Reinvention doesn't just destroy his ego, it restores your identity in the most beautiful way possible. When you move on like he never mattered, you reclaim something he always assumed. He owned your emotional narrative. He believed he left a mark so deep that you would always carry him with you, not because he loved you well, but because his ego fed on the idea of being unforgettable. Men like this often mistake emotional damage for emotional impact. They think that because they hurt you, they've earned a place in your story. But when you begin to live as though he was just a chapter and not the entire book, the ego feels something it almost never experiences: insignificance. And that feeling burns far deeper than heartbreak. A man's ego thrives on being the exception, the one you can't let go of, the one you stay stuck on. So when you rise, heal, and detach without theatrics, without chasing, without posting indirect quotes to make him guess, it disrupts his entire self-image. He expected to be a ghost in your mind. Instead, he becomes irrelevant, not because you force it, but because you've genuinely outgrown the version of you that once wanted him. And that truth is more painful to him than anything you could ever say out loud. What destroys his ego most is not that you stopped reaching out, it's that your energy shifted. You stopped thinking about what he's doing, who he's with, whether he regrets it, whether he misses you. You stopped checking his online status. You stopped replaying conversations in your head. You no longer crumble at the thought of him. Instead, you started thinking about you, your goals, your inner peace, your emotional safety. You started feeding the parts of yourself that he always ignored. And the more you healed, the more his relevance shrank. The ego loves to believe it is unforgettable. It needs to be needed. It needs to be the center of someone's emotional universe. So, when he realizes you're not replaying the past, that you're not hoping he circles back, that you don't get triggered by old memories, his ego fractures. Because now he has to face a truth he never wanted to consider. You're not suffering without him, you're thriving without him. Men rarely regret losing a woman immediately. The ego shields them at first. It tells them they made the right choice, that they can replace you, that you'll always linger somewhere in the background. But as time goes on, when the initial distraction fades, when the novelty of freedom wears off, when no one else gives him what you did emotionally, that's when the cracks begin. And if, by that time, you've healed to the point of neutrality, that realization doesn't just hurt him, it unravels him. Because what he ultimately has to accept is that he didn't leave a permanent scar. You healed without his apology. You grew without his support. You found peace without his closure. You rebuilt your self-worth without his validation. And you became a version of yourself he no longer has access to, influence over, or relevance within. That's the moment he realizes he didn't just lose the relationship. He lost the privilege of being remembered. When you move on like he never mattered, one of the deepest shifts happens inside your energy. You stop responding from a place of fear or lack, and you start responding from a place of certainty and self-possession. That inner shift is what truly destroys his ego, because it shows him something he never expected to witness, a version of you that is completely beyond his reach. The fourth keynote is all about that transformation, the moment you start prioritizing your peace so powerfully that he can feel the distance even in your silence. There is something magnetic about a woman who sincerely protects her emotional world, not by building walls, but by choosing herself without apology. When you stop letting him back in through emotional side doors, the late-night memories, the just-checking messages, the maybe he'll change fantasy, you create a boundary that speaks louder than any confrontation could. And this boundary is what unsettles him, because he once believed he had a permanent key to your mind. He thought no matter what he did, no matter how inconsistent or careless he was, he would always be able to slide back into your emotions whenever it suited him. But then something in you snaps, not in a dramatic way, but in a mature, grounded way. You stop asking questions that were only hurting you. You stop looking for answers that were never going to soothe you. You stop making excuses for behavior that wasn't aligned with how you deserve to be treated. Slowly, you begin to remove him from the center of your decision making. You start thinking about your emotional safety the way you should have all along. And each time you choose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, boundaries over breadcrumbs, he feels the shift. This is the part that hurts his ego most. He didn't expect you to find yourself without him. He believed his inconsistency would keep you uncertain, his mixed signals would keep you hoping, and his bare, minimum affection would keep you hanging on. But when you step back and allow yourself to truly process the situation, you realize that the very things you thought were love were actually attachment. And attachment can be broken. What replaces it is self-respect, and nothing threatens the ego of a man who failed to value you like the rise of your self-respect. Your emotional stability becomes the punishment his behavior never earned but desperately needs, not because you want revenge, but because you finally understand what you deserve. You no longer react to his sudden interest, you no longer melt at his compliments, you no longer feel pulled by the version of him you created in your mind. Your emotional center becomes something he cannot disrupt anymore, and that loss of influence is devastating to someone who once relied on your emotional sensitivity to feed his sense of importance. And what truly rattles him is that your peace doesn't look angry, it doesn't look vindictive, it doesn't look like you're trying to win. It looks like neutrality, a calm, quiet, effortless detachment. You don't need to block him to prove a point. You don't need to post anything to make him jealous. You don't need to pretend you're okay. You are okay, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself to walk away from the version of you that tolerated emotional crumbs. A peaceful woman is the ego's worst nightmare, because peace means he no longer has the power to affect you. And when he sees that he no longer has that power, it doesn't just bruise his ego. It shatters the entire identity he built around being someone you couldn't forget. When you move on like he never mattered, something powerful happens. You stop giving emotional CPR to a connection that died long before you walked away. This is about rebuilding your life in such a way that his absence becomes irrelevant, not because you're pretending to be strong, but because you've genuinely outgrown the version of yourself that you once accepted so little. And the beauty of this phase is that it's not loud, it's not dramatic, and it's not revenge-driven. It's quiet evolution. It's choosing to build a life so full, so aligned, so peaceful, that he becomes a non-factor in your emotional equation. That's what destroys his ego, not your anger, but your evolution. Most people think moving on is about cutting ties or replacing someone. But the deeper truth is that real moving on happens when your world expands beyond the space they used to occupy. When you're no longer checking your phone for a message that may never come. When you no longer wake up with that old ache in your chest. When your days start to feel full again. When your plans no longer include the ghost of who he used to be. That's when the shift becomes real. And this shift threatens his ego because it symbolizes something he never wanted to believe. You didn't need him to become the woman you were meant to be. What breaks him isn't that you start going out more or looking good online. It's that your happiness stops being performative. It becomes internal, it becomes stable, it becomes something he didn't contribute to and can't take credit for. You start pursuing goals that he never supported. You start nurturing friendships he took for granted. You start exploring passions you put on hold while trying to make him feel important. Your life becomes this new ecosystem of growth, joy, and self-discovery, and he realizes he played no role in any of it. That realization slices straight through his ego because it contradicts the narrative he built, that he was essential, irreplaceable, unforgettable. As your world expands, the emotional space he once occupied naturally shrinks. He becomes less of a memory and more of a lesson. Less of a loss and more of a turning point. You stop romanticizing the past because your present becomes something you actually want to be in. This is the moment when his ego starts to panic internally because he never imagined you could build a life that didn't revolve around the fragments he left behind. He thought your heartbreak would give him a permanent residence in your mind, but heartbreak fades and self-respect grows. And growth is the one thing ego can't compete with. The more you grow, the more he starts to feel the difference. He may not say it, but he notices the change in your energy. You're unavailable for the conversations that once kept you stuck. You're unmoved by the same behaviors that once broke you. You're uninterested in repeating cycles that drained you. You stop responding to breadcrumbs because your life is now full, course meals. And when a woman becomes full within herself, the man who failed to appreciate her always feels the emptiness of what he lost. What ultimately destroys his ego is the moment he realizes that your life did not collapse without him, it expanded. The version of you that he took for granted no longer exists. You evolved into someone he can't reach, can't manipulate, and can't impress in the ways he used to. You became someone who won't settle for what she once tolerated, and that forces him to face the most painful truth for any ego-driven man. He didn't just lose you, you outgrew him to the point that he no longer belongs in the life you're building. When you move on like he never mattered, the final layer of impact comes from the version of yourself that emerges after the storm, the confident, self-assured, unshakable version that he never anticipated. This is about becoming a living testament to everything he failed to appreciate, a constant reminder of what he lost without you ever needing to point it out. It's the culmination of your detachment, your reinvention, your inner peace, and your happiness. It's not about seeking revenge. It's about embodying a life so full, so aligned, and so untouchable that his ego struggles to reconcile the reality. The woman he underestimated has moved forward, completely without looking back, and nothing he does can change that. The power of this phase lies in authenticity. You aren't acting for anyone's benefit. You're not performing or pretending to be okay. You are genuinely thriving because you have chosen yourself and your growth over someone who failed to recognize your value. That authenticity is what makes him feel the loss so acutely. He can't argue with your energy, he can't manipulate your reality, and he can't reclaim what he never contributed to creating. The version of you he left behind is gone, and the new version of you is untouchable. Your laughter, your confidence, your focus, your peace, all of it becomes the loudest message that you were never defined by him, and now you are entirely beyond his reach. This is where the ego feels the sharpest sting. He believed he had a permanent place in your world, that your emotions, your decisions, and your happiness would always orbit around him. But as you step fully into yourself, you prove that his assumptions were wrong. Your independence, your self-respect, and your inner strength cannot be taken away. Each time he sees you thriving without him, whether it's in your career, your social life, or your emotional state, he is reminded of the gap between what he thought he had and what he never truly earned. That realization doesn't need words. It is communicated through your presence, your poise, and the unshakable trajectory of your life. Another powerful aspect of this is consistency. It isn't just about moving on momentarily, it's about sustaining a life that reflects your self-worth over time. Every day you wake up prioritizing your goals, nurturing your passions, and protecting your peace. You reinforce the message that you are no longer dependent on his validation or approval. Ego fears permanence. It thrives on temporary victories, fleeting attention, and emotional leverage. But when you live in a way that demonstrates long-term stability, joy, and growth, his sense of importance diminishes without any confrontation. Your life becomes a benchmark of what he lost and can never reclaim. The transformation also rewires the narrative of your story. While he may have seen you through a lens of availability, vulnerability, or longing, he now witnesses a version of you that is complete and self-sufficient. That contrast between the woman he underestimated and the woman you've become is often disorienting for him. He realizes that the version of you that relied on him is gone, replaced by someone whose happiness, confidence, and trajectory are entirely self-generated. And nothing frustrates an ego more than knowing it can no longer influence or define what it once believed was within its control. Ultimately, this isn't about proving him wrong, it's about proving yourself right. It's about living a life so aligned with your values and so focused on your growth that he becomes a secondary character in a story he never fully understood. And as your joy, peace, and power continue to expand, his ego continues to feel the loss, the absence, and the undeniable truth. The woman he once underestimated is thriving entirely on her own terms, and nothing he does can change the reality that he no longer matters in your world. The impact is complete, quiet, and unforgettable. In the end, moving on like he never mattered isn't about proving anything to him. It's about proving everything to yourself. Your peace, your growth, and your happiness become living proof that you are untouchable, independent, and fully in control of your life. His ego may feel the impact, but your life is the reward. By choosing yourself over the past, you step into a future where his absence no longer defines you, and your strength becomes the quiet, unstoppable force that leaves him realizing what he lost, while you thrive beyond it.